In all of this, what do you think of Jesus?
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed.
Something happened recently that was so unexpected and so shocking that people everywhere are still talking about it. Joe Rogan, one of the most influential people in America and the host of the biggest podcast in the world, invited a brilliant young Christian apologist named Wesley Huff onto his show. Now, Rogan has had Christians on his podcast before, but this one was different because for 3.5 hours, Wesley was masterful in how he articulated the reliability of the Bible and how he defended Jesus and the gospel. I would love for everyone to check out the whole episode, but I also know that it takes half a day to get through the whole thing. And who has that kind of time these days? So my team and I thought it would be helpful if we watched a few of the highlights from Rogan's conversation with Wesley Huff. And after each one, I'll share a few thoughts.
The search for our origins is one of the most human endeavors. One of the most, because to know that we are particularly unique. We're so different. We stand out from every other animal on this planet. And there's this crazy, wild war of biology where life is just eating life all around us. And we just got to some crazy place that far beyond any other creature that's on this planet.
Yeah.
And we did it in a bunch of different ways. We did it in a bunch of different ways all over the place with different scribbles and different icons and different gods and different things. And we're all wondering, like, which one, where did it start? What was the origin of all this? Like, what was the need to write these things down? What purpose did it serve to have these myths and legends and stories? Like, was it just to keep society together, or was it to retell a very important story that was a very unique thing that happened at the dawn of time?
And that's why you see, I mean, the literary comparison of ancient Near Eastern origin stories is like a really interesting thing to do, because when you look at something like the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian creation story, and then you look at something like Genesis chapter 1, there are obvious crossovers with, like I said before, these ancient Near Eastern conventions. But then you can see that the author of Genesis is making these points that are actually rebutting something like the origin stories of the surrounding cultures that largely believe that matter is like eternal and the gods come out of the created world, and that there's this narrative of the battle that takes place where some gods fight against other gods, and the world around us that we see and like human beings are the end result of this battle. And so they would read this on every Babylonian New Year. And one of the main themes was basically that, like, it's all chance. It's all a random mistake. You were created without purpose and intention because Tiamat gets destroyed. And she's the god that, you know, you come from. And then you read Genesis chapter 1 and it says, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and he makes it good. And there's this idea that, like, that's countercultural in the idea that the Babylonians did not think that the world was good. And that, like, at the end of every refrain, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, and then it's very good at the end. And that humanity in particular is created in the image of God. Like, that's a very, not just like kings, which a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures believed that kings were created in the image of God, but that humanity in general is created in the image of God. And this idea of the Imago Dei, that that's why you're different. Like, why are you different from all the animals? Because you're given something that exemplifies of a unique quality. And then the ancient Near Eastern cultures that believe that, you know, the planets are gods and that the sea is a god. And then Genesis chapter 1 looks at that and it kind of subverts the expectations of the day in getting to this ultimate question of, you know, why are we here? What are we supposed to do while we're here, and how do we get out of here? And it says that, no, there's purpose, there's meaning, there's intention. And actually, a lot of the things that you worship, it's pretty stupid because God created them.
That's such a great clip. That's a great example of how the whole conversation went for 3.5 hours. Wesley Huff is really special, and I really appreciate just how concise and plain spoken he is. He's super smart and obviously a fresh face in the world of Christian apologetics. And I hope you'll look up the rest of his work online. He's really awesome. It made me think about how I grew up in the Bible Belt of the United States in the 80s and 90s, and I was a preacher's kid in this tiny town. And so when I went off to college, I really had a very narrow and shallow understanding of the world, I guess like a lot of Christian kids did back then. But I still remember being in my first religion class and learning that there are other ancient creation stories besides the book of Genesis. And it came as such a surprise to me. I didn't know it then. And some of them, this is what really surprised me, like the Enuma Elish, which Wesley talked about in that clip. Some of them are even older than the Bible. And so my professor at the time, who had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder as far as Christianity is concerned, he was suggesting that the people who wrote the Bible basically plagiarized the Enuma Elish and other sorts of writings like the Epic of Gilgamesh and others that you find from ancient Near Eastern sources. And the Bible writers just inserted their own God in the place of these other gods. So they sort of stole from these older cultures. And that idea really shook me for a lot of reasons. I mean, it led me over time to demote the Bible from what I thought it was to something less. I thought the Bible was true and perfect, the Word of God, in its cover to cover, and I just demoted it over time from that to just one of many ancient myths and legends. And for the next 13 years of my life, I really saw the Bible like you see an artifact in a museum, something that's cool to study, but that has no real authority over you. That's how I looked at the Bible for a long time. And it took me a while to realize that just because there are other older stories in existence, that doesn't make those stories true. And just because Genesis 1 shares some things in common with those older stories, it doesn't make Genesis 1 false. And I think Wesley nailed it in this clip when he said that the Genesis creation story was written as a rebuttal to those other stories, as a corrective. And if we really want to understand these stories, instead of looking at how they are similar, we should look at how they're different. So the Enuma Elish says that the universe was created basically accidentally, like as a byproduct of this battle between the gods that was raging on. And Genesis says, no, that's not how it happened. There was one God. There is one God who made the universe, and he did it on purpose, and he created order out of chaos, and he created us. And so the question is, when you look at the world, what do you see? Do you see something that looks more like a cosmic accident that was made by chance without any forethought? Or be honest, do you see a universe that has all the hallmarks of some intentional forethought and design? And when you look at us, when you look at human beings and how different we are compared to everything else in the universe, compared to other animals, for example, what do you see? Do you see a species that was created as an afterthought just to be slaves to the gods, like the Enuma Elish says? Or do you see a unique and special species that stands apart from the rest of creation because we have this divine spark of reason and creativity and freedom? I think it's pretty obvious to most of us that however we got here, this universe isn't a random accident, and human beings are more than just an afterthought and more than just a bunch of slaves to the gods. We seem to be here on purpose, and our world appears to be governed by all sorts of laws and constants that make it possible for human beings to study it and understand it more all the time. So Wesley's point is that instead of seeing Genesis as a copycat myth, we should look at it as a countercultural rebuttal against the other stories that were circulating at the time. Now, if you disagree with that, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I'm sure that I will, and we can have a conversation there. But let's watch the next clip together.
The universe is bonkers.
Nuts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we get that in history too, whereas we have these kind of what we think are established conventions, and then all of a sudden we discover something and it like completely overthrows the ideas that we have.
Like Clovis first.
Yeah, or go back to Tepe.
Yeah.
Or actually, good segue.
That's the best one, right?
So, yeah, I made something for you.
Ooh.
So, I make papyri facsimiles. Oh, my description is a little bit wonky here. Yeah, fix that. So you were talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly? This is exactly what it looks like?
Yeah, so I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
You did a great job, dude.
And
this is, you nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded
listen,
out. This is a real nerding out of.
So that's actually, yeah, so that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
And where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, "What is truth?" Wow. But so part of my research, so the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century.
Yep.
And so he had this, he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis.
Yes.
So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and he incorporates this into history. And he says, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the later gospels have a very like the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus. And so he says, based on this, John is the last written one. And it combines these two where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. Well, we discover this guy. C.H. Roberts is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even like most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Wow, indeed. Rogan expressed some amazement there, and he should be astonished. I am astonished by the continuing developments of dating the biblical books in the New Testament, because for decades now, the prevailing wisdom has been that the New Testament wasn't written until long after the life of Jesus. You probably heard these theories. I learned them in seminary, of all places, that it took centuries for the New Testament to come together as we have it today. And so the implication there is that it can't be trusted, because it was passed down by word of mouth and changed and manipulated for hundreds of years and into what we have today. But here's Wesley Huff presenting Joe Rogan with this gift, this hard evidence that the Gospel of John was written in the 1st century, which is pretty convincing evidence, and that would be pretty shocking, given especially that most New Testament scholars, I would say almost all New Testament scholars, acknowledge that of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written last. So if John's Gospel is clearly a 1st century document, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were almost certainly written in the middle of the 1st century, maybe the 60s or even as early as the 50s AD, which puts them squarely in the timeline of eyewitness support. So evidence like this might not mean a lot to everyone, but I think it presents a real challenge to anyone who tries to dismiss the New Testament offhand as just a legend. Why? Because legends take time. They take centuries to develop. The eyewitnesses and people that know the eyewitnesses all have to die off before a legend can spread and form. So I think the message here is that anyone who looks at the New Testament and looks at Jesus, anyone can choose to reject what they see. Like that's perfectly, that's up to everyone's judgment to reject it on the merits. But I don't think anyone can claim, like I used to, that the New Testament is just the result of a 4th or 5th century religious conspiracy, because it just doesn't add up when you look at the evidence.
Terence McKenna had a great line that said that science requires one miracle. The Big Bang. It requires a miracle.
Well, I always say that when people ask me about, the miracles in the Bible. Yeah. And I say, well, if the first miracle happened, if everything, nothing became everything, then, Jesus turning water into wine.
That's an easy one.
Well, yeah.
That's a party trick.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is nothing compared to the birth of the universe, but we're convinced at the creation of the universe, and we're very skeptical at other miracles. It's very odd.
Yeah,
it's very odd.
I think there's an inconsistency there. And you do see when the Big Bang is first hypothesized that there are individuals who are uncomfortable with that sounding like in the beginning. Because before that, the idea was that the universe was eternal.
Yeah.
And if you propose a point in time where everything starts to exist, well, and you see some of these people are pushing back on it. They say things like, well, that sounds too religious. That sounds like a beginning point in time.
Right.
And at that point, if there's a big bang, you have to figure out, okay, well, what's the big banger?
It's interesting to me that there are certain things that we think of in terms of like unexplained phenomena that we'll accept because we have some sort of a scientific definition of what this unexplained phenomena is, like the Big Bang. I mean, and you can say that there's theories. It's not completely unexplained. They kind of get it, but you kind of don't. Something that's smaller than the head of a pin that becomes the entire universe that we say is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
You know, and just to say that just happened and you don't really, I know you don't want to say you don't know, but you really don't know. There's no way you can know. It's not really possible to know. There's no like working theory where you can convince me that the whole universe gets compressed into something smaller than the head of a pin and then instantaneously becomes everything that you see.
Well, I think that's why you see natural materialism being woefully inadequate to really explain the ultimate worldview questions that we have.
Just the universe itself, right? Just what we don't know enough. Maybe we one day will. Maybe these, sentient AI systems that we're going to create with quantum computers are going to be able to figure things out in a way that we can't. But at the end of the day, you have one miracle. You have the Big Bang. All of science agrees this happened. That is so much crazier than anything that any religion is proposing. That it's so interesting to me that we say we have echoes of the Big Bang. There's radio echoes. Yeah, but also if a miracle did take place, like let's assume that there is actually a higher power that occasionally interacts with human beings. And if a miracle did take place and you were there, you don't have a camera, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a pen, you can't write things down, maybe you can't even read. And you have this thing that happens to you, and this thing changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, that the ideology that these people subscribe to and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That in itself, even if this is just a revelation without a divine interaction, that's a f***ing miracle.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all. Like the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of, was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Bananas. It is. It's pretty bananas. There's so much in that clip. But at the end of it, you heard Rogan refer back to a conversation that they had before that we're not covering in this video. But it was a conversation about the Dead Sea Scrolls when he talked about Isaiah and that scroll being intact and perfect. And this is a fascinating realization. These Dead Sea Scrolls were written like a few hundred years before Christ. So they're very, very old. And they were stored way back then and hidden in caves, and they remained there, hidden in those caves until the 20th century, 1947. They were discovered accidentally by some shepherds in the region. And researchers started looking at those scrolls, and they found that the the Dead Sea Scrolls contained the Old Testament books, almost the entire Old Testament, including a fully intact scroll of the book of Isaiah. And when this discovery was first announced, before they said, the specifics about it, everyone sort of assumed that those ancient scrolls that were 2,400 years old would be vastly different from the modern day Old Testament that we have today. And if that were true, it would have been a real problem for Christian apologists and others who love the Bible. But what they found and later announced was that there is almost total congruence between those ancient scrolls and our modern day Old Testament today. And the Isaiah scroll was a word for word match to what we have in our book of Isaiah today. And that discovery shocked the world, especially academia. And so much so, that guys like Rogan call it a miracle because it sounds like one. But the bigger point of the clip, I think, is that it's not just religious people that want miracles or that rely on miracles. Modern science does too. And we don't often talk about this, but And I know some people hate it when Christians like Dr. James Tour, who we recently had on this channel, when they point out how science does require at least one miracle, and the miracle being the Big Bang at the beginning. But in this clip, it wasn't a Christian saying it, was it? It was the biggest podcaster in the world, who happens to be a former atheist and who I think today might be described as an agnostic. I just love how Wesley said, it was funny. He said, if there was a Big Bang, then who was the Big Banger? And when I was watching this video, originally my kids were with me and they're teenagers. And when they heard Big Banger, they laughed. And so all week long, we've been calling God the Big Banger in our household. And I know that some will say that all this sounds a little sophomoric, a little bit like God of the Gap stuff, like Christians say all the time and get criticized for. And, the idea being, if we don't know the answers yet, then that must be God, and that's a problem, because as we find more and more answers, we find the need less and less for God. I'm sensitive to that argument, but I don't believe it applies in the same way to this particular question of how the universe came into existence, or the question of why we're here. I think deep down, most of us sense that there must be a supernatural mind behind the natural world. And the only question that remains is, what do we do with that instinct and the evidence that supports it?
In all of this, what do you think of Jesus? Like, in terms of your own journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed. So the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean he was the Son of God? Does it mean he was just some completely unique human being that had this vision of humanity and this way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever? So what is he the Son of God? Well, are we all? That's another question, right? Do we all have that inside of us? Do we all have that ability to change everything around us inside of us? Do we all have that unique connection to the divine? And is he a representation of the best version of that? Or was he an actual person that was the Son of God? And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what does it mean? It's just the fact that it's a question to ponder is a miracle in itself, in a way. Just the fact that there's this concept of this person that died for our sins, that's the Son of God, but you have to you have to believe in a bunch of stuff to go that way. Like, just the concept of that is interesting to people, because what it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. And if you do follow that, I know a lot of Christians are hardcore Christians. They're some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. Right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, right? But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
And you don't know how you can wrap your head around that particular claim.
And if he came back, here's the thing. If he came back, who the believe him today? With all the fake news and all the CGI and AI, like, imagine. That would be the most bizarre thing of all time.
That's a really extraordinary bit of the conversation, and it goes on from there. That's almost at the very end of their conversation, and they go on to talk about Jordan Peterson and other things, and I just think this is so extraordinary. First of all, it's such a courageous move for Wesley to interview the interviewer in this case and turn the tables on Rogan with this really heartfelt question about Jesus. And I thought Rogan's response was really honest and sincere. It's like he's so close to the truth, he can taste it. Like, he acknowledged that Jesus existed and that I think the word he used was unique and extraordinary. He knows what Jesus's, friends and contemporaries wrote about him, the claims that Jesus made, but for some reason, Rogan's just not quite ready to take the leap and put his faith in Jesus. And he alluded to maybe part of why that is. In part because you also have to submit, he said. You have to submit to all this other stuff, to all these other beliefs. And that can be really hard to do. It comes at a cost. the cost of discipleship, and I know firsthand how hard that can be, how costly, especially if you've spent years of your life building an identity for yourself around being sort of agnostic and contrarian and sort of open-minded about all faiths and all worldviews like Rogan has. It would be especially challenging for somebody like him who's probably got a lot to lose, let's be honest, were he to ever come out as a Christian. I mean, I don't know if sponsors would be happy about that. I know many of his longtime hardcore listeners and viewers probably wouldn't be very happy about that. But I will say, I've been following Rogan's career for a long time now, including his podcast. I don't watch it every day, but pretty frequently. And even though I don't always agree with him, I think he's proven himself to be an authentic human being. And I think his pursuit of the truth is real. He's really curious, genuinely wants to know. And so I feel like should that journey continue, and should he continue to pursue the truth with this sincerity, there's a pretty good chance that he's going to come one day to the same realization that I came to and that billions of others will come to, that Jesus was more than just a really gifted man, more than an archetype, more than this ideal person we're all aspiring to, more than a moral figure. He's God in the flesh. He's the creator of all things and the source of all truth. And he's the answer of all our deepest questions. Okay, that was a lot of fun. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe right now to see more videos like this one in the future. Leave us a note in the comments if you have questions or pushback, or if there's a video that you'd like us to react to in the future. Thanks so much for watching.